So my name is Oren Kessler. I'm Deputy Director for Research at Foundation for Defensive Democracies. We're a think tank that focuses on foreign policy, Middle East policy, national security. And I'm here to talk about ISIS in the Sinai Peninsula on Israel's doorstep. I'm going to be talking about Israeli-Egyptian cooperation in fighting ISIS. I'm going to be talking about Hamas relations with ISIS Sinai. I'm going to be talking about what the insurgency looks like, how many lives it has cost on the Egyptian side, on the Israeli side, and whether indeed the Egyptians, with Israeli help, can get a handle on this insurgency.
Where does ISIS fit in the overall scheme of Islamic extremism against Israel?
So Israel's got quite a tumultuous regional environment, as you know. It's got Hezbollah in the north, it's got ISIS and various other groups and the Syrian regime in the northeast, it's got Hamas in Gaza. It's got the Islamic State in the Sinai Peninsula. This is no small thing to have an effective, deadly branch of the Islamic State that's very committed to what it's doing, that's been launching about 2 attacks per day, mainly against Egyptian targets, but also Israeli ones on occasion. This is no small thing, and I think the Israelis are taking it extremely seriously.
Is the Islamic State something which is contained, or does it have like cancer cells throughout the Muslim world?
It certainly has been growing, much like a cancer, as you say, in the Islamic world. Thankfully, it's been rolled back to an extent in its sort of main area of operations, its central core area of operations in Syria and Iraq. It has not been eliminated, but it's been rolled back from several key areas. In Sinai, by contrast, we've seen an expansion from its sort of core area of operation in northeast Sinai near Gaza to now expanding to an extent to central Sinai, closer to Israel, closer to the tourist resorts of South Sinai. So it's a very disconcerting development on that front.
What kind of a role would ISIS play in an Iranian-led northern attack, for instance? And do they have cells around maybe not just the West Bank, but even among Muslims within Israel?
So there has been some ISIS activity or ISIS sympathetic groups in the Gaza Strip, and this is something I think Israel and indeed the U.S. should be watching very closely. Thus far, there haven't been many indications of ISIS presence in the West Bank or among Israeli Arabs. It could happen. Thankfully, we haven't really seen it yet. So the main sort of area of ISIS concentration in Israel and its vicinity is really Sinai and to a lesser extent Gaza.
And how cooperative is Egypt in fighting, or are they just putting on a window dressing?
I think they've been very serious about fighting it, not out of any great love for Israel, but because it's a threat to them first and foremost. And the Egyptians have destroyed at least 2,000 tunnels over the last 6 years, which is really an extraordinary number given sort of the fact that Gaza is only 7 miles wide, that they've been able to destroy, that there were so many tunnels in that small area. These are smuggling tunnels between ISIS Sinai and Hamas. There have been hundreds of counterterrorism operations. The Egyptians have been very serious and very committed about this. Unfortunately, they haven't always been effective, and that's what we need to watch and wait and see if they can be.
What are the prospects that if Egypt fails for political reasons or military reasons, that Israel would take military steps against ISIS?
Let's hope Egypt doesn't fail entirely in this mission. They've got it to a certain stasis where year on year the same number of people are dying and being injured. It's roughly 1,000 people, which is no small number. I would be very surprised if Egypt were to allow Israel to conduct military operations on its territory simply due to Egyptian sensitivities about sovereignty and suspicions of Israel. That said, there have been reports that the Israelis have waged a number of drone attacks on Sinai militants. Neither Cairo nor Jerusalem has confirmed this, but there have been such reports. ISIS Sinai says that these operations have happened. The most recent was just last month. And I find it plausible that indeed that is the fact, very quietly, that Israel is indeed engaging in the occasional operation to help out the Egyptians. Just recently, just last year, ISIS Sinai put up some photos on its social media that showed its fighters using an Iranian sniper gun. And as you may expect, Israel and Jews are sort of a mainstay of ISIS Sinai propaganda and rhetoric. There was last spring, ISIS, the whole sort of worldwide or region-wide ISIS network put out a media campaign of 14 videos from the various branches in Iraq and in North Africa and elsewhere promoting the Sinai Jihad and praising the Sinai Jihad. And a running theme of these videos was sort of Israel and the Jews. They portray Sisi as, quote, a new pharaoh, but unlike the pharaoh that we know from the Torah, this pharaoh is in league with the Jews. He's, quote, protecting the Jews. Sinai is, quote, the gateway to Palestine from which ISIS the Islamic State will liberate Jerusalem and Al-Aqsa Mosque. It calls the Israelis victims in waiting, whom ISIS will deal with after it has dealt with the Egyptian, quote unquote, apostates. And then most gruesomely, it says, these videos say that Israelis will soon meet the same fate. Quote, the knives, and this is a bit gruesome, the knives used to slice open the necks of your spies, namely the Egyptians who are supposedly collaborating with the Israelis, will slaughter your soldiers tomorrow. Now, it's been almost a year since these videos, and there hasn't been a whole lot of follow-through on these very dark threats. Although last month there were 2 rocket salvos from Sinai to Israel. These are the first rockets since 2014. And then just this month, ISIS has a weekly newsletter in Arabic called An-Naba. There was an article in An-Naba showing the execution of 3, quote-unquote, spies for what ISIS called the Jewish state. And I thought it was quite interesting that ISIS is able to say those words, Jewish state, but Mahmoud Abbas appears unable to do so. So what has Egypt done in response? The centerpiece of the Egyptian response has been the destruction of the tunnels. As you know, the Gaza Strip is run by Hamas. The Gaza Strip is therefore under blockade by both Israel and Egypt, and Hamas can only get its weapons, its goods, cars, farm animals, whatever the people of Gaza want or need, tends to come in through these underground tunnels from the Sinai. Now, so this is a win-win sort of operation for both the smugglers on the Egyptian side, who charge exorbitant rates and make a lot of money, and for Hamas as well, which taxes these tunnels exorbitantly as well, and levies huge taxes on the goods themselves. So since 2011, the Egyptians have destroyed at least 2,000 of these tunnels, which is an astonishing number when you consider that the Gaza Strip is about 7 miles wide. I mean, that's roughly Israel at its narrowest near Tel Aviv is about 9 miles. Gaza at its widest is 7 miles, and there were 2,000 tunnels running through this area, particularly in Rafah, which sort of straddles Sinai and Gaza. And the Egyptians have been quite creative in doing so. They've flooded some of these tunnels. Sometimes they've flooded them with sewage. They've built fish farms on top of them. So that's been really extraordinarily successful, and the commitment that the Egyptians have shown has been quite impressive. The Egyptians have also created a buffer zone. It's a kilometer-long buffer zone in which they've essentially raised much of the Egyptian side of Rafah in order to stem this smuggling problem. And there have been hundreds of counterterrorism operations. Now, Egypt says it's succeeding in countering this threat. It's a little bit hard to take at face value. There have been nearly, or rather last year, there were nearly 700 attacks in the Sinai. It's nearly 2 attacks per day. That's 60% more attacks than there were in 2015. And the threat has also expanded to central Sinai more recently, and that's closer to Israel. That's closer to the tourist resorts of South Sinai, Dahab, Nuweiba, Sharm el-Sheikh. So one bright spot in all of this is that cooperation between Egypt and Israel is at a high point. I was in both Egypt and Israel in November, shortly before the elections here, and this is something that both sides confirmed to me. They're very quiet about it. They don't like publicizing this cooperation. The Israelis would love to publicize it, but the Egyptians are very hush-hush about it. As you know, Israel is a rather sensitive topic in Egypt, but relations have never been closer. On the intelligence front, surveillance, there have even been reports of Israel Air Force drone attacks in the Sinai. Now, neither side has confirmed this, but just last month, ISIS Sinai claimed that the Israelis had struck a cell of their militants in the Sinai who were trying to launch rockets. So the threat to Egypt, I think, should be clear. It should be self-evident. And I've talked about the threats to Israel, but I'd also like to sort of expand on why this matters to the U.S. Why does Sinai matter to the U.S., and more broadly, why does Egypt matter? Some of these reasons have remained constant for several decades. Egypt is the most populous Arab state. 1 in every 4 Arabs is an Egyptian, and Egypt is undergoing a tremendous population boom. It had 66 million in 2000. It's got about 93 million right now. By 2050, it could have easily 150 million people. It's got the 12th biggest army in the world. It's a key member of the alliance of sort of moderate, relatively moderate, pro-Western Arab states that are aligned against the pro-Iranian camp. And of course, the peace treaty with Israel is the first treaty, of course, that any Arab state has struck with Israel, and it's one that's sort of a pillar of U.S. Middle East policy, and it's one that we use as an example and incentive to other Arab states to make peace with Israel. That if you just make peace with Israel, you'll get all of this aid money and you'll get all these great American weapons. The Suez Canal is obviously extremely important. 10% of all international shipping goes through the Suez Canal. And you can just imagine what a terrorist attack on the Suez Canal would look like. The Suez Canal happens to run right along the Sinai Peninsula as well. And the U.S., since the peace treaty, or since Egypt joined the U.S. camp in the late 70s, the U.S. has had expedited preferential treatment through the Suez Canal. The migrant crisis. Just imagine if Egypt were to go the way of Syria or Libya, a country of roughly 100 million now, 150 million soon. Imagine if those tens of millions were to join the exodus, shall we say, to Europe. Finally, but no less important, U.S. peacekeepers. There's been a peacekeeping force in the Sinai Peninsula since the peace treaty. Half of that peacekeeping force, about 700 troops, are American, and they're directly exposed and vulnerable to this jihadist threat. So I'm going to wrap it up here. I'm going to move to Q&A. I would just say, Sinai isn't Las Vegas. What stays in Sinai what happens in Sinai never stays in Sinai. And again, I think I've laid out why it's such an important matter to Egypt and indeed to Israel, but I just want you to leave you with the idea that it's extremely important to U.S. interests as well. So with that, I'll wrap up and I'll go to Q&A. Thank you. Thank you very much. I think we're going to have to use the microphone. That's what I've been told, so I'll start with you, sir.
Understanding of the supply line that is supplying ISIS.
Yeah.
I was under the impression that Iran was fighting ISIS in Iraq.
Yeah.
Are they assisting ISIS in Sinai, and what does that mean for Israel?
It's a very good question, and the short answer is yes. They claim to, not claim, they are fighting ISIS. They're aligned against ISIS in Syria, but when it comes to Sinai, anyone who's fighting Israel, who's fighting the Jews, is good by them, and they are supporting ISIS Sinai. I mean, you could make a similar, one could ask, why is Iran arming Hamas? Why have they armed Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad all of these years? There's supposedly this Sunni-Shia rivalry. it's because they're fighting Israel, and that's good enough. So yes, this is actually something I think we should probably highlight more, is the hypocrisy of Iran claiming to be leading the charge against ISIS in Syria and Iraq while arming them in Sinai, or certainly trying to. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Can you describe the demographics of the people living in the Sinai? Are they all Bedouins, and are all the members of ISIS Bedouins, or
Okay. Sure.
how many people live there?
Sure. It's a very good question. The question was about the demographics of Sinai. Who lives in Sinai? What proportion of Bedouin are ISIS, and what proportion of ISIS are Bedouin? It's about 70% Bedouin. It used to be more, but the Egyptian regime settled mainland Egyptians in El Arish and that region to sort of Egyptianize the peninsula. It's roughly 500,000 people total, and this is an area roughly 3 times the size of Israel, so it's extremely sparsely populated. And even those 500,000 are concentrated in a number of towns sort of near Gaza, and to a lesser extent in South Sinai. The vast majority of Bedouin are not ISIS. That said, a certain proportion of those who are not ISIS are willing to turn a blind eye. There are familial ties. It's obviously a very tribalistic society, and if your cousin is a member of ISIS, you're probably not going to turn him in. There's tremendous suspicion of the regime. There's a tremendous sense of the expression is my brother and I against my cousin and I against the world, right? So there's a sense of familial loyalty that prevents family members, for example, from turning on each other. But no, the vast majority of Bedouin are not ISIS. As to the second part of your question, this insurgency is mainly homegrown. It's mainly Bedouin from Sinai. There are some Egyptians, non-Sinai Egyptians, mainland Egyptians. There are some foreigners, probably from Libya, perhaps from Syria, but in the main, it's a homegrown phenomenon. Yeah. Yes.
This is a little tangential, but perhaps you have an opinion. I understand that China has built a city in Egypt and $1 billion or more, and I wondered whether their influence in any way impacts this issue.
It's a good question. The Chinese are building a new capital, quote unquote, in the desert northeast of Cairo. The Chinese are quite heavily involved in the Egyptian economy, but they're there to make money, and they're there to expand their geopolitical influence. I don't see any real fingerprints, Chinese fingerprints in the Sinai insurgency. It's not. Their goals are quite different from Iran's, for example. They're there mainly to make money. Yeah.
Do you find any resonance in the U.S. State Department identifying this particular group of ISIS under the overall umbrella that they seem to look at and identify?
Okay, so whether this branch is part of the overall.
And the U.S. State Department in their play.
I think there's a lot. I'll answer that question in the broader sense of sort of U.S.-Egyptian relations. U.S.-Egyptian relations have taken quite a hit under the Obama presidency. Whatever your thoughts about former President Obama, the Egyptians were quite ready to see him make for the exits. President Sisi was the first foreign leader to congratulate President Trump on his election victory. President Sisi was the only foreign leader whom Trump met at the UN General Assembly during the campaign. So I think there's, and I hope this is addressing your question, there's room to improve bilateral ties, and I think and I hope that folks at the State Department are cognizant of that and are working towards that. I think military to military ties are quite good, but in terms of sort of State Department to their foreign ministry, White House to their presidential palace, there's a lot that needs to be repaired from the Obama era, and President Sisi is coming here next month, so I think both sides are quite aware of that. Sure.
The, the eastern Sinai along the Gulf of Aqaba has become the Egyptian Riviera, many resort hotels there, and that was attacked a number of years ago anyway, by some jihadist groups. And that area also is very vulnerable for Israel because of the proximity of Eilat. Is any of that activity related to the ISIS organization you're talking about?
It's a good question. In 2004, 2005, and 2006, there were terror attacks in South Sinai, in the resorts that you speak of, which incidentally were all built by the Israelis. Egyptians like to forget about this, but all of those resorts were originally Israeli built. And the Taba Hotel the Hilton Hotel in Taba was Israeli built, of course, and that was attacked as well. ISIS didn't exist back then. That was various other groups under various different names. But the Egyptians remember that very well. Egypt and particularly Sinai are extremely dependent on tourism. Tourism has dropped in Sinai dramatically, particularly since ISIS took down that Russian passenger jet on Halloween Day, 2015. The Russians, there are no more flights from Russia to Sinai. Brits used to flock to the Sinai. They aren't coming anymore. So the economy is really hurting, and the Egyptians are well aware that those resorts could be under threat. And as I mentioned earlier, the ISIS presence has been spreading to central Sinai. They've got their eyes on those resorts. And that's something the Israelis are watching very carefully, not least because Israelis still go to Sinai. And they've started returning. They stayed away for a while, but now they've started returning. Yeah.
Not to be like a punk or anything, but what's the big deal if there's like 1,000 ISIS affiliates in the Sinai compared to like the huge Egyptian army and the Israeli airstrikes? Okay,
good question. The big deal is that those 1,000, and again, that's just an estimate, have resulted in 1,000 killed or wounded on the Egyptian side. And you would think that the Egyptian army would be able to handle this threat, but after over 3 years, they haven't been. And the Israelis, I mean, if the Egyptians were to let the Israelis handle it, they probably could. But it's obviously a very sensitive topic. There may be a drone strike here and there from the Israelis, but the bulk of that cooperation is merely on the level, not merely, but only on the level of intelligence. There's just no way, given Egyptians' sort of sensitivity about sovereignty, that they would probably let any foreign country handle their insurgency, and Israel would be the last on the list that they would. So it looks like a relatively easy problem to solve, but the Egyptians haven't been able to do so, and they've been quite resistant to take advice from the Israelis or from the Americans, for that matter. They take intel from the Israelis. Every now and then, reportedly, they'll let them do a drone strike, but in terms of advice, they're very reticent in terms of taking it. Yeah.
I'm intrigued by the term homegrown. Particularly in this area, it seems like we see an indigenous discontent among Bedouins, but the manifestation is not really self-sustaining. We've got a broader social media that's fertilizing the discontent, and we've got a capitalization of weaponry that's largely from outside the region.
Right.
Is there more we need to understand about homegrown, how it's used, how to engage, because it really doesn't seem like it's a self-sustaining movement.
It's another very good question. When I use the word homegrown, I meant that the fighters are mainly local, but you're absolutely right in that social media drives this sort of activity. Social media has brought a certain foreign fighter contingent to the Sinai, and as you state, the weapons are overwhelmingly coming from elsewhere, from the west in Libya, from the south in Sudan, from the northeast in Iran. So this is true. Homegrown is probably, maybe next year I won't use that word because is probably in a certain sense inaccurate, because there are foreign powers, the Islamic Republic of Iran, the ISIS mothership who are stirring this insurgency. So it's a very good point. I mean, the nexus between social media and terrorism is extremely complex. It's beyond the scope of this session, but you're right that there are absolutely outside powers who are stoking this. Yeah.
Are we using social media in a counterterrorism way?
I don't think it's been particularly effective. No.